Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking a bit about the Xbox brand, where it came from, where it's going, and honestly what's going on with them. Before we do that though, if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all my social media stuff in the description. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, my travel channel. I appreciate the support on those platforms. Thank you so much. Let's get into it. So before we get into that though, you might have noticed the mic is still here. I've asked a lot of people what you guys think of this mic being in the shot. A lot of people say like they like the audio, but they don't like it in the shot, especially if I'm doing other things. It can be kind of distracting. Also, there was an RGB light on it, which I've since covered up for gaffer tape. So what I've kind of made the decision is in most videos, this probably won't be here. We'll go back to the old setup, but in videos where it's just a discussion like this one, I'll probably keep it around. But anyway, so yeah, that's what's going on. Now, moving on. Keep in mind that what we're talking about here is something that's kind of active and relevant, so if anything seriously changes, this video will obviously be out of date. But at the time I record this video, about a week ago, Microsoft announced that they were shutting down several studios. If memory serves, that was Arcane Austin, Doghead Games, Roundhouse Studios, and Tango Works. Or Tango? It was, interestingly, Tango was the only Japanese developer that was actually owned by Microsoft. Fun fact, Japanese laws actually prevent foreign corporations from buying Japanese corporations. However, that doesn't apply to something small like a game development studio. It would only apply to, say, something like Nintendo, Sega, Sony, whatever. Which is why if you ever see somebody out there be like, Microsoft should just buy Nintendo, just don't take their opinion seriously. They don't know anything about Japanese law and how that's completely impossible. So whatever. Anyway, moving on. Yes, so they shut down those studios and everybody was like, it's a dumpster fire over there. What's going on? And I kind of want to talk about that, but not so much. Like, honestly, with that, there's a whole lot of external factors that has to do with things like the pandemic being over, which really accounted for a lot of issues because a lot of people were being hired remotely to do additional content while game demand was high, and then suddenly it wasn't anymore. At least it wasn't as high. Obviously, Microsoft has gone through a lot of acquisitions, so a lot of jobs have become very redundant, but also there's just other factors at play. And I'm not defending these practices. I think it very much sucks, but it's really what I wanted to do is talk about the history of the Xbox brand and kind of why this might also be happening, which largely has to do with a lot of corporate shifting and potentially Microsoft's entire overall strategy completely changing as far as the Xbox brand goes. So let's discuss that. Now, in order to fully understand this, I think you need to understand why Microsoft got into video game consoles to begin with. Now, if you know your history at all with different companies, every one of them gets in it, money, right? But for different types of money. Like Nintendo transitioned into video games because they were effectively a toy company, and it went from there. But Microsoft was a little different. What I'm about to say to you will seem ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous in the year 2024. But you must understand that in the 1990s, the era in which I grew up, this was a very real thing. Microsoft was legitimately afraid that the home computer, the PC, the personal computer, was under a direct threat from video game consoles, and that could actually be knocked out of the home. Again, I know that sounds ridiculous, but let me elaborate on why. If you're not old enough to remember this, home computers, PCs, personal computers, were very rare in the 90s to actually own. Like I got my first one, my mother got it in 1992, and we only got that because her job required her to have it. She never really understood how to use it. We couldn't really make it do much, but it was like our first PC. And if I recall correctly, it ran on Windows like, 3.1 or something like that. Eventually we got an upgrade and thinking like 95 or 96 that ran on Windows 95. And, it happened, we got a couple of computers in that time, but nothing super significant. But I was a freak, like I would go to school and, the only stuff you'd ever see there was Mac stuff, like Apple-based products. Nobody really had Windows-based stuff at schools, at least not the ones I was at. And none of my friends had PCs until about, some of them started getting around 96, 97, 98. That's when it became vastly more common for people to actually have computers, which is like, okay, that's a few years, whatever. Now you got to remember that because that was so abnormal, video game companies were actually kind of looking to get into that market to see like why people were interested in having a PC. And it was mostly down to what you could basically do at the time, which was just like limited communication and functionality. And so they actually, this is going to sound ridiculous, but it's true. Microsoft looked over at Sega and saw a threat. And what I mean by that is, in the mid-90s, 1995, the Sega Saturn was able to play games online. It actually still can to this day because it used peer-to-peer technology. There were even versions of the Sega Saturn that could be sold specifically to schools that included a keyboard and so on and so forth that had a lot of the same rudimentary functions that PCs were able to do at the time. Granted, PCs were better at it, but that didn't necessarily matter. And so Microsoft actually got involved with Sega when they were making the Dreamcast. So if you actually look at your Dreamcast, if you have one, on the bottom right side at the front, it will say compatible with Windows CE, which is an iteration of Windows that you could easily use to make games for the Dreamcast and bring it on over. Microsoft also made software for it called Web TV, which was a Japanese-only release. Microsoft was very involved with the Dreamcast creation, but they wanted to be because they wanted to understand more about what this industry was and if it was a potential threat to them. You have to remember that the Dreamcast also marketed itself as having SegaNet. It's going to be online. It's going to have a keyboard. It's going to have a mouse. And I know this is, again, ridiculous in 2024 because obviously PCs are vastly more capable and can do a whole far wider range of things. But at the time, your average, user really kind of just understood, I guess I need to check my email and send messages sometimes. Like, that's about it. Don't forget, a lot of us were still using AOL as our ISP. Like, it was a thing. So if you could hypothetically buy this video game console, which is already a popular booming industry, from these big known companies, and on top of it have all the functionality of a PC, then wow, what do I need a PC for? It's a big old box. This thing is much smaller and can do more things. That's what Microsoft was terrified of. So they went ahead and they created the original Xbox. The original Xbox was Microsoft's way of basically helping to determine the direction the video game industry was going and to try and lean it away from being a threat to PCs. And they were also afraid of what Sony was doing. Sony, if you're old enough to remember this, as much like Sega did, they marketed it initially a lot as like it can replace your PC. It's going to have a DVD drive in it. Ours will also have a keyboard. Ours is going to have a hard drive, which did eventually happen. And ours is going to have a modem, which took later. But regardless, it ends up being a huge success. Officially, it sells 155 million units. And now, conveniently, as the Switch is about to catch it, Sony has moved the goalpost and saying it sold 160 million. But either way, even though it was a massive success, Sony's online component of it and its direct threat to the PC never really panned out. And you can argue that a large part of that is because of how Microsoft pushed them. And, of course, Microsoft's creation of Xbox Live and everything revolutionizing that side of things so that everything just seemed easier on a console. But point is, when the Xbox ended, the original system was over, Microsoft was net negative $4.4 billion. That's how much it cost them. But they ran it at a loss, fully aware of that, because they didn't care about that system. What they cared about is just making sure PCs weren't under threat. And I would argue they actually succeeded. By the end of that generation, I don't think anybody realistically anymore thought of that possibility. It was so standard at that point to have a home computer that it was just like, yeah, they're two separate things and that's how they should be. They succeeded in that goal. Now, I would argue they had probably had meetings internally that said like, okay, we did it. Do we just stop now? But the decision was made, you know what? We spent all this money. People seem to actually like us. Why don't we try again, but maybe we can actually make this profitable? Hence, sorry, a little squeak there. Hence the Xbox 360. Now, the Xbox 360 tried to make changes to the original Xbox where they had failed. The most notable and obvious one was the failure in Japan. So much so that they actually hired a Japanese engineer to be the developer of the shape of the 360. That like white hourglass figure was actually a Japanese developer. They got a lot of Japanese engineer, and they got Japanese developers on board to make a bunch of exclusive content. Basically said, we don't understand your market. You go ahead and make your own games, and it just whatever. And the system actually worked over there. This is always a tragic story. The system actually was pretty successful in Japan for like the first 4 or 5 years. And that was largely because they were making a lot of shoot 'em ups and date sims and anime stuff and, idle pop and all this other stuff that the Japanese really like. It became kind of this otaku system that was in some ways the spiritual successor of the Japanese iteration of the Sega Saturn. And that, while it never took over the market, it did well enough that Microsoft's like, all right. And the system actually did pretty well over here, as well as even did decently enough in Europe. So they were actually doing all right. And then two things happened. One is the most obvious, which was the Red Rings of Death fiasco, which ended up costing them about like $2 billion in repairs, which pretty much ate any chance of overall profitability of the system. And then entered this man. This is Don Matrick, a Canadian reject who came basically to the States to destroy Xbox, as far as I can tell. If you guys don't know much about this guy, there's one thing he's really well known for, but we'll get to that. Before that, though, he took over the Xbox 360 division, I want to say Xbox division in general, around like 2009, 2010. And I don't know which of these decisions were his, but he clearly had influence. So a few things changed around the time he took over. One, I think he was probably told to try and find more profitability streams. And one of the ideas, I don't know if he had it personally or if he just authorized it or what, but you might remember, if you're old enough, that when you would turn on your 360, of course, it had a dashboard and they would regularly update the dashboard. They got it to a point where it was now feeding you ads. You were seeing Mountain Dew ads and Doritos ads and Super Bowl ads and all this other stuff that you're just like, ugh. It was constantly being thrown in your face when you were on the dashboard. Now, from their perspective, it probably made sense because it was just, hey, we can make some money off of these companies and we don't really have to do anything. It's just our users just turn on the system and they see an ad for a second. We can make some money. Great. It was symbolic. It wasn't necessarily the most annoying thing in the world, but it was definitely symbolic. But also what he did with the Japanese. So again, the story I understand here, I assume he was in the room. I assume he's the one who pulled the trigger, but I don't actually know this. But here's apparently what happened. Around the time he comes to power, there is a request from Microsoft in the US to find out what is going on with Microsoft in Japan. How is the Xbox doing? We get some money out of it, but we don't really know much about what's the ground game. What are they doing over there? And so they're presented with essentially a show and tell of what is the Xbox 360 there. And it's all these games that are shoot 'em ups and date sims and all the stuff I listed before. And apparently people at Microsoft were mortified because they were like, what is any of this? They didn't understand it whatsoever. And they basically said, you can't do this. It was like embarrassing to have their name on it. And so they more or less made it very difficult for developers at that point in Japan to make that kind of content anymore, and effectively told the Japanese, no, you don't want anime stuff and date sims and shoot 'em ups. What you want is Madden and Call of Duty. That's what you want. And from that decision, the Xbox 360 completely tanked in Japan. It was over at that point, and it never recovered. To this day, the Japanese openly reject the Xbox brand. There was a little bit of a resurgence during the pandemic because of the convenience of Game Pass and because of PS5 shortages, but that bubble has since burst and is completely gone. So yeah, that was pretty much the end of that. Now, after that, we get to what Don Matrick is best known for, the Xbox One debacle. Now, for those who don't remember this either, in 2013, I believe it was the spring or summer of 2013, I don't know how much Don Matrick was involved with all of the minor decisions of the Xbox One, but what we do know is he had presented us with this onstage performance about TV sports and nothing really about it being a video game console. Now, part of the reason for that is under the 360, particularly under his time there, digital content became more predominant. Now, it had happened before him, like, you could download games from the arcade and all that sort of stuff, but it came more of a distribution method, but also more of an entertainment method. The HD DVD thing hadn't really panned out, but you know what had? Netflix. Netflix took off and became this downloadable app you could install. In fact, I remember when a bunch of different services were like, hey, we have an app too. Like, I used to work with Machinima. Machinima had an Xbox 360 app. Like, everybody was trying to get in on it because nobody knew which ones were going to work out. So I think that mentality was really kind of built into the Xbox One. Make it an all-in-one entertainment center. That's the future of Xbox. Hence the dual HDMI ports, so you could have input and output, so everything could feed through it like it's a set-top box or whatever. So it had that. I give them some credit. They continued to maintain music CD support, which was nice of them to do. But of course, while it would have streaming options like Netflix, etc., it also had no real effort or concern for how games would work. The system was anemic out of the gate, meaning it was out-of-date technology by comparison of the PlayStation 4 at the time. Granted, it was more capable than the Wii U, but everybody understood that was because that was Nintendo being Nintendo. And the most obvious, of course, was all the terrible policies. The Kinect was one of the most failed things about the 360, and they decided to integrate it as a required feature of the Xbox One. And it cost the system $100 additional. So for $500, you could get the Xbox One with the Kinect. For $400, you could get the PlayStation 4, which was more capable and had none of these policies. What are those policies? Well, not only was the Kinect required, but so was online DRM. You had to keep the system connected to the internet at all times or it wouldn't function. And people were just not about that. I remember protesting it. I made videos at the time being like, this is a horrible idea. I don't want this. And those videos and things like that, they actually panned out. What ends up happening is that Microsoft clearly had a moment internally where they had to figure out what to do. And what we do know happened is that Don Matrick was doing his interviews and he was saying really stupid things like, oh, if you don't like our policies online, we have an old thing for you called the Xbox 360. Like, he was just being a jerk about it. That's a famous interview, by the way. But eventually Microsoft, someone over at the board of directors perhaps said like, yeah, we got to change this. And so the decision was made to have Don Matrick effectively write an apology letter to the public, which was effectively like, I still believe in the future of Xbox, but I've misread the market and we will make certain changes. Like, it was one of those. Really, it was very passive aggressive. But in that, the Kinect was going to be removed. The DRM requirements were going to be removed. And then, of course, Don Matrick himself was removed. He got his golden parachute and went off to I think it was a mobile developer called Zynga or something, whatever. He got like millions of dollars for screwing up the entire brand. It has to this day never recovered. We know now, since that incident, that Microsoft had actually been toying with the possibility of just outright canceling the Xbox One release and just abandoning the whole thing entirely. That it was that close to happening. Now, what apparently did occur is that because if Microsoft had successfully protected PCs, they weren't there for that reason. The 360 had worked, but not well enough. It basically broke even. It would have made money had it not been for the Red Rings of Death. So what was the point of this machine anymore? Other than it being a jobs program, I suppose, which some people at Microsoft would have been like, well, who cares? What was our market aims anymore if it wasn't going to yield a direct profit on us anymore? So Phil Spencer apparently went to people at Microsoft and said, like, I have an idea, but it's going to take a long time. And he effectively convinced them that he could do a lot of brand damage control and he could reverse the ship, but he was also going to try and change the strategy entirely to be about, what if we make Xbox the equivalency of Windows, but for video game consoles? Meaning, it is like, if you think about a PC, 99 times out of 100, that thing is running on some iteration of Windows. Like, yes, you obviously have Apple products, which are their own corner, much like a Nintendo product that's in its own corner. But when it comes to actual PCs, you have a token amount of people using things like Linux or Ubuntu or whatever, but pretty much everybody's on some iteration of Windows. Why not be able to do that with Xbox? Make it some sort of service, that functions on everything. And this idea is so old that people were making videos on it a decade plus ago. I have videos talking about this exact same idea because it was out there. They were talking about it. Phil Spencer successfully convinced people at Microsoft he could do that. Now, how do you do that? Well, a few years later, he introduced exactly that concept after doing a ton of damage control by, he pretty much changed everything about the Xbox One short of its name, because it was the one thing he couldn't really change, including a very quick redesign in the Xbox One S and all that. But yeah, he made these changes and then said, okay, now we're going to do this new thing called Game Pass. Now, the idea with Game Pass was he looked at the success of something like Netflix, which was a subscription service you sign up for, and then all this content is on there and you can watch whatever you want. You're not paying it as a one-time use. You're just paying for the subscription service. If Netflix can make that work, why can't we? That might have been a little naive, but the numbers were not exactly the same. And over time, he was basically like, okay, in order to make that work, you need kind of more of a global dominance. But because of Microsoft having issues all the way back in the mid-90s over antitrust monopoly laws, which is part of why they got in this in the first place, they also were like, let's be a little smarter about it this time. So they gradually would absorb certain developers and still allow them to produce content on other platforms. Mojang was an obvious one. When they bought out Minecraft, they still allowed it to exist on other platforms. Obviously, they bought out things like Bethesda and now very recently Activision, which we'll get back to. But the whole strategy was, we'll buy up these companies for relatively small at the time, and we'll have their content that can just coexist and everything can kind of be under this one umbrella. But he probably very much so warned them, like, this strategy will take a lot of time. It will take a lot of money. And they were like, well, if the end result is that we effectively dominate video games overall, I think it's worth it. That was the decision that was made. And that was the strategy that kind of went through the rest of the Xbox One and into the Xbox Series S and X. However, what I think has finally changed is the acquisition of Activision ended up being a lot more bloated and more complicated than I think they anticipated. They ultimately did pull it off, but it might have been the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were, because Microsoft no longer, it used to not really care how much it cost to get into this and make this strategy work. Now they seem to care. So let's talk a little bit about how Game Pass itself works from a financial perspective. If a game is in Game Pass, there's two possibilities. Either Microsoft owns it outright, and since they own it outright, they can just choose to throw it on their service, and they're not really too concerned about the cannibalization of sales. So something like Sea of Thieves, which is a game that Microsoft created through Rare, somebody they had bought years earlier. They didn't really care too much about the sales of the game as long as it existed functionally on Game Pass. Now, granted, there were digital sales of it and all that, I know, but the game could exist there and it was fine. They didn't really care too much about the loss as long as it kind of kept people on Game Pass. But that doesn't apply to third parties. If a third party company, say a Sega or whatever, wants to make a game, they have no incentive whatsoever to put it on Game Pass. And the simple reason is, if you, the user, are subscribed to Game Pass, you pay your whatever it is, like I don't even know what it is because I'm subscribed to it. It's like $15 a month. I'm making that up because I honestly don't know. If you're paying that much a month, and all the games you want are on there, you have no reason to go out and buy something like Sea of Thieves or any other game that would show up there. So Sea of Thieves, again, owned by Microsoft, they don't really care. They want you there. How do you handle some new Sonic game from Sega? Sega doesn't want their game on Game Pass because that would mean that they're making, anytime anybody's like on Game Pass and just downloads the game for free, effectively, they don't get anything out of it. So what is their incentive? And what we know now is that Microsoft would basically go and cut blanket deals with companies and say, hey, we want the new Sonic game on Game Pass. We'll cut you a check for like $150 million. I'm making up that specific situation and that specific amount. It's just basically, ballpark how it works. They just cut them a blank check, more or less, and say, like, that guarantees a certain amount of sales. You're still allowed to sell it separately, either digitally or physically, but this will allow it to be on Game Pass. And the idea was that would bring in more customers to Game Pass. But it doesn't really work when you're not paying enough for Game Pass. You're basically just paying enough to be on it. And the idea was, if we had enough people subscribe to it, we ate up enough of the market share, then eventually you more or less have a monopoly minus token resistance from things like Nintendo. And we could then kind of raise the price to whatever we want because everybody has to be here. This is where the party is. That strategy has not panned out the way they planned. At least that's the way it seems. So I'm guessing that someone over at Microsoft, their board of directors, CEO, et cetera, was like, this needs to change. Because after Activision, look how much we spent on this, and this is not going anywhere. They really just got Activision, if we're honest, for Call of Duty rights, because Call of Duty is one of the handful of franchises that is so big that it brings all the casuals to the yard, and frankly, there is the money you need. But they also are not really allowed to do that per certain antitrust laws I believe, in the United Kingdom, as well as the United States and others. They're basically forced to give Sony and I think even Nintendo some consolidations on that. So they don't even get really out of what they wanted. Point is, I think it was bigger than they anticipated. So they've been doing some reshuffling. We know now Microsoft, Phil Spencer has moved over to a different job. I believe he specifically is like head of Microsoft Games, and Sarah Bond is now, he got his old job at the head of Xbox, and Matt Booty's in there doing other things. And recently, since all this news, they've all been giving a lot of contradictory statements. Some are saying things like, we need to focus less on these like indie smaller games like Hi-Fi Rush. That was cool and all, but it didn't really make any money. So let's focus on these big AAA games. Hi-Fi Rush was a game that was completely screwed over by Game Pass because it was made by Bethesda, specifically Tango Works, and the Japanese one. And then they were told, like, well, your game didn't make any money. It's like, yeah, it didn't make any money because you wouldn't let us sell it. You forced it onto Game Pass, and then you blame us for that because you own the games. You understand where that problem comes in? Basically, Japanese company makes a game owned by Microsoft. Microsoft says, we own this. We're just going to throw it on Game Pass for free. Game, therefore, has very poor sales because there's no incentive to buy it from the mass market. Then Japanese company is blamed for that. Now, kind of take that, extrapolate that to basically everything on Game Pass. Game Pass basically steals the lunch of everybody who puts games on it. But when Microsoft owns those specific games, there's nothing you can really do about it. Only third-party developers make money on Game Pass, which is even further reason Microsoft is starting to reconsider it, because they're basically just the only people making money on Game Pass is not them. It's everyone else. So that strategy has not been working. Hypothetically, it could work if you have complete domination, but how much do you have to spend to get said domination? And it appears, based on those statements, not only where they're saying, oh, we need less small games, some of them are also saying we need more small games. It seems to me, and I'm not in the room with these people, but it seems to me that Microsoft, someone at the higher ups, basically said this has to change, and they're all kind of running around with their heads cut off like chickens, not knowing exactly what to do next. And if I had to guess, I'm saying there's probably a couple of moves that are going to happen here. One, some of these Microsoft-owned properties, and we know some of them already did, like Grounded, Hi-Fi Rush, as well as Sea of Thieves, and there's another one that I don't remember offhand, are being brought over to PlayStation ecosystems and Nintendo Switch ecosystems. That way, the games that they already developed, they already own, and had no chance of making any money on those platforms, now can bring in additional revenue to kind of cut some of the losses, since you've effectively said the PC and Xbox versions are never going to make money because you essentially gave them away for free. You got to throw some of those titles out there. And once you do that, you're starting to allow more and more of your content out there, thus more and more cannibalizing the actual hardware division of the Xbox and overall the service, aka the entire previous strategy. But that seems to be the direction they're going with that in the short term. While also reshuffling and shutting places down to save costs. That seems to be part of the strategy too. Now, when I think they come out of this, we do know that they are working on yet another iteration of hardware. Whether or not it'll have any sort of physical element to it, I don't really know. When I say physical, I mean like physical media, and my guess would be no. We don't really know that exactly yet. I partially think they're going to do it largely just to keep the brand relevant. But at the same time, I think what they might be doing is switching Game Pass to a more of an Amazon Prime model. This is me being purely speculative right now. I do not know this, but my guess is that's kind of what they're going to do. Amazon Prime, if you're not familiar, Amazon Prime is a service you can subscribe to on Amazon that has certain perks. Like you pay either a monthly fee or an annual fee for a reduced rate, and you get like free shipping and all this other stuff. And the benefit with that on top of it is they also have a video streaming section. And in that video streaming section, there's a whole bunch of content you as a Prime member can watch for free. But there's a whole bunch of stuff there you also cannot watch for free. You have the option to either rent it for something nominal like $2.99, and rental meaning you can play the video for like 48 hours or something, or you can buy it, and I say that in quotations because digital content is not property, and you can have access to it, quote unquote, permanently, which is never permanent, by the way, for like $7.99, $8.99, $9.99. I could see Microsoft doing that, taking Game Pass in that direction. You basically subscribe to the service of Game Pass for whatever it is, $14.99 a month, whatever it is. And then there's a whole bunch of games on there that are like the lower budget things. Occasionally you get one token AAA release or whatever that you can play that's all built into your service. But then there's other ones, bigger titles, something like a Call of Duty, where they're like, well, you can have it, but you can rent it. That's going to cost you an extra like $3.99, and that'll be good for 30 days. Or you can just buy it, again, quotations, for $15.99, $14.99, whatever you want. They'll come up with the prices, of course. That's a good way to kind of hook more revenue out of people, because the simple reality with Game Pass is it is not profitable, and it has really made substantial impacts on the gaming industry as far as the revenue model. So it would not shock me if Microsoft was finally out of patience with it. And I think if we're seeing a major corporation decide they're either changing their strategy or they're just outright abandoning, this is exactly what it would look like. I personally don't think Microsoft is giving up on gaming entirely. I think that they're going to try a couple of different things, and I think that would not shock me if that's the route they go. And how long that lasts, I don't know. But as far as their hardware goes, I think that they're going to do another system as more or less a delivery mechanism for whatever the new strategy is. But again, I maintain, and I've been saying it since I didn't have gray hair, that eventually the whole idea is take Xbox as a brand, as a service, and integrate it into other things, eliminating the hardware and just making it this thing that is considered essential, much like Windows is effectively essential to PCs, or Amazon Prime is more or less essential to buying things online, if you want to buy through Amazon, obviously. I think that's what they want to do. Now, whether or not they can, anyone's guess. But I'm curious, what do you guys think? What do you think of all of this? I very much want to hear the discussions down below, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this little history lesson as well. So if you guys could do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't done that before, as well as check out all my social media stuff in the description. I got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon. I really appreciate the support over there. Like, seriously, I do. As well as the travel channel. I appreciate all that. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all later.